I'm back. Oh my goodness. So my computer decided to take a dump, but we fixed everything and we're back. So we're just going to wait for everybody to get in here again, and then we'll get started. So when you get in, say hello. Say hello. We're going to be doing the Great Pestilence Part 2. Part 2. So this will be interesting. We're going to get a little bit more into exactly what occurred through Western Europe during that time. Hi, Damon Bard. How are you? I hope you're doing well. Hi, Raven. Sorry about that mishap. My computer decided to take a dump, but I guess that's what happens when you talk about pestilence. So, yeah. So I hope everybody has had a great week, and we've had a very good week, and I hope you guys have a very good week coming up. Hi, Mikey. How are you? I hope you are doing well. You're doing all right, Damon. Well, that's good to hear. I hope you're feeling better. We're feeling, well. So, but yeah, I think we've got a few people in here. So we'll go ahead and we'll get started. So we had spoke last week about the actual plague itself, and why the 1340s bubonic plague or Black Death was so catastrophic. Plague is always bad, and it's always catastrophic in many ways historically. But this one was a big one. This one hit so much harder than, like, say, the Justinian plague that happened. I think it was around 500 AD, and then of course they had the one in the 19th century in Hong Kong that was pretty bad. But it gave us a lot of insight as to what occurred during the mid 1340s when the Black Plague came into Western Europe, and just the devastation that it brought with it. So we kind of went over that. We went over what it is, why they think that there may have actually been other forms of disease and sickness that somehow made its way along with the Black Death, the bubonic plague. Because remember, the Black Plague, it's not always in the bubo form. It can either be bubonic, pneumonic, or septicemic. Hi, Carl. How are you? So this week we're going to go ahead and we're going to talk about exactly what route it took, how some of the different areas actually dealt with the plague, because some of the stories are fascinating, and how those reactions actually formed a lot of what we know today as the 21st century and the 20th century, or modern day, I should say. Why we do some of the things we do, why our economics are the way they are, and things like that. So it's very, very interesting. So in the middle of the 14th century, one of the most devastating events in human history occurred, wiping out over 1/3 of the population of Europe. Hi, Jigs. Yes, please share. Hi, Cindy. We do like to determine, and we love for you guys to have the ability to determine who sees this, not Zuckerberg. Because, they love their little algorithms, and they'd rather we pay than get organic likes and shares. So thank you very much, Jigs. We really, really appreciate it. So, this particular plague wound up wiping out 1/3 of the population of Europe, and that's a lot. The Great Pestilence, or bubonic plague, moved out of Asia, moved west, then south, then west again, then north, eventually looping back around east and ending almost where it had started. Hi, Calvin. The Black Death, which swept through Europe, the Near East, and North Africa in the mid-14th century, was probably the greatest public health disaster in recorded history, and one of the most dramatic examples ever of emerging or re-emerging diseases. The Great Pestilence would ravage Western Europe between 1347 and 1353. Now, for people that research this particular plague, you're going to find a little bit of variation in those years, especially the 1347, because some historians will count the actual plague as it was moving out of like China and Asia and places like that. But we're looking really, when it comes to Western Europe, 1347 is really kind of, where it starts. And so Jig says, no problem. You always have the best stories for me to listen to. No problem. Well, thank you. We do appreciate it. And I appreciate it very much. By the time it had ended, it would have killed between 75,000 to 200,000 people. And that's a lot, even with the population boom that they had, within the 100 years prior. But how exactly did it start and find its way into Europe? In a general sense, it would, of course, be trade routes. But to understand how it happened, we have to look east to Crimea on the northern coast of the Black Sea near present-day Ukraine. For many years, there had been tense relations between the region's tribal Mongol traders and the Genoese merchants of present day. These embers of hatred would burst into flames in the city of Tana after a fight between Genoese Christians and the local Muslims in Tana. One Muslim local was found dead. Sensing trouble, the Genoese fled to Kaffa, where they were, hi Tom, where they were granted protection. By the 1340s, Kaffa was a thriving city, heavily fortified within two concentric walls. The inner wall enclosed 6,000 houses. The outer wall enclosed 11,000. So roughly about 15,000 homes were within the protection of Kaffa's concentric walls, which would be like an outer wall and then an inner wall. Now, the city's population was highly cosmopolitan, including Genoese, Venetians, Greeks, Armenians, Jews, Mongols, and Turk peoples. In 1346, at the port city of Kaffa in the Black Sea, the Mongol army, better known as the Golden Horde, lay siege upon the Genoese merchants at Kaffa. And this has kind of been just a long-going thing between the Genoese merchants and a lot of like the tribal kings and things like that of the Mongol people. Now, Kaffa did not turn out to be as feeble as the Mongols expected. Staring the Golden Horde in the face, Kaffa struck back in defense. Kaffa had access to the sea, and they made adequate use of this, bringing in supplies and reinforcements from Italy. And this siege actually went on for quite some time. Now, while the Mongols laid siege to the city of Kaffa, they were struck by what we know as the bubonic plague. And of course, they didn't realize, exactly how huge and horrifying of an issue it would be, but the Mongols were the first ones to come down with it. According to accounts by Gabriel de Musi, the events of Crimea, he states, the Tatars or Mongols were suddenly struck by the pandemic, falling on all sides as though they had been struck by thunder. With lumps on their joints and dark marks on their faces, they developed a putrid fever and were beyond help, neither from doctor nor their god. The spread of the plague through the ranks of the Mongols demoralized the army, and a large bulk of them lost interest in the siege. However, the Mongols would not back off, not without giving Kaffa a piece of their own torment. They put the corpses of their dead into their trebuchets and flung them over the defensive walls of Kaffa. The dwellers of Kaffa watched as rotten bodies fell from the skies, crashing onto their soil, spreading the putrid smell in all directions. The Christians could neither hide nor flee from the havoc that rained down upon them. They moved as many rotten bodies as they could, dumping them into the sea as quickly as they could. Now, as the disease took hold, the Genoese merchants fled across the Black Sea, bringing the plague with them. As it happened, and this is by Musi again, as it happened among those who escaped from Kaffa, yes, lumps on their joints, and I think they also meant groins. But you have to remember this was 1340 writing, so they probably didn't know about lymph nodes. They just took it as joints. I'm assuming, Tom. I don't know, but it still sounds horrible. As it happened, among those who escaped from Kaffa by boat were a few sailors who had been infected with the poisonous disease. Some boats were bound for Genoa, others went to Venice, and others to other Christian areas. When the sailors reached the places and mixed with the people there, it was as if they had brought evil spirits with them. Every city, every settlement, every place was poisoned by the contagious pestilence. And their inhabitants, both men and women, died suddenly. And when one person had contracted the illness, he poisoned his whole family, even as he fell and died, so that those preparing to bury his body were seized by death in the same way. Thus death entered through the windows, and as the cities and towns were depopulated, their inhabitants mourned their dead neighbors. Now, centuries later, interestingly enough, this would be recognized, the Siege of Kaffa, as the first use of biological warfare in history. So we have a lot of firsts that kind of go with this particular plague. And then so Maud says, lumps and bumps. We love the girls with the lumps and bumps, Frank. All right, and we're going to see what's going on in the chats real quick. So I found that really interesting that was the first recorded case of what they considered biological or germ warfare. Let's see, who all do we have here? So Damon Bard brought up a good case. Wasn't it the fleas that caused it? At the beginning, yes, but with the different forms of plague, the bodies themselves can be contagious, especially if you're flinging bodies over walls that may have the buboes that are filled with the pus, because someone with the bubonic form is not necessarily very contagious to other people unless the buboes burst. Okay, it's the pus and you know, different bodily fluids and things like that actually carry the disease. So kind of think about that when they were trebucheting those bodies over the walls, and also understand that some of these bodies may have been clothed. So it's very likely that there could have been fleas within the material of the clothing too. So you know, that's something to consider too. And that's some of the information that I went over. They kind of covered that too. So, but it is a great question. So Liz says chemical warfare, chemical warfare, chemical warfare, warfare. Yes, there was a lot of that flinging over the walls. Okay, so let's go ahead and get back to this real quick. Let me wet my whistle. Okay. Now, Constantinople, we're going to kind of jump to Constantinople real quick, was considered the gateway between the East and West and was already suffering from the plague. Okay, so keep in mind, Musi said that the ones that were able to escape from Kaffa left in boats. And boats, they're going to be headed home or some place of safety. So they're traveling over water at this time. Now, Constantinople at this time was already suffering from the plague, which had most likely made it there from Hubei, or the Hubei province in China, where most scholars think the 14th century plague originated. Now, from these and other major trade centers, the plague moved through the Mediterranean by water and by land through caravan routes. Though the Genoese may have brought the plague home with them, they were not the only ones carrying the plague westward. So remember I talked about like a first wave, and this is kind of what they mean by that. So, you know, some scholars, I'm not going to say all, because there's a lot of thoughts on this, think that, you know, it was mainly because of the people that left Kaffa and hit the port cities. But really there's a lot more information to show that actually Western Europe was getting ready to be hit by two actual ways, one from the port cities and one over land. So they were going to wind up getting a double whammy is what would wind up happening. Now, by late 1347, the port cities of Genoa, Venice, Messina, Marseilles, and others were hard hit by the Black Plague. From there, Black Plague then radiated outward as people tried to escape the first wave of the plague as it crested in Western Europe. As they did this, it is recorded that many died along the way, were just left there on roads, in ditches, the forest, seashores, in the water. Along the way, it took out religious leaders, government officials, the rich, the poor, the old, the young, the sick, and the healthy. Because the plague moved faster by water, it hit the port cities of Western Europe and the Italian peninsula first. It was also moving westward by land from the east, eventually making it impossible to escape its ravages. Early in 1348, hold on just a second, where's my pad? Early in 1348, it reached Florence, Italy, a robust and wealthy, deeply religious, and densely populated city. This was the home of Dante, Michelangelo, and many others who were just starting to emerge during this time. Now, April of 1348, there were recorded, because the one thing about Florence is they were really, they were really good at keeping records. And you'll see that in some places. Some places were really good at keeping better records, even throughout everything that was going on with the plague, than others. And so in those cases, scholars and scientists kind of just have to make a best guess, or you know, as to what may have occurred there. And there are a lot of towns and villages that just completely went extinct. So we really don't know what happened in those particular settlements. So a lot of the ones that I'm going to use to kind of show how different areas reacted to the Black Plague and how the Black Plague interacted with them would be the ones that had, you know, the best records at the time. So in April of 1348, Florence recorded a number of 60 to 80 deaths by plague daily. April 3rd, the city fathers, in an effort to contain the plague, ordered all clothing belonged to victims to be burnt rather than sold, because things were made by hand at that time. It was not uncommon, if they were nice clothing, that the family would sell that. Almost like you see estate sales now with furniture and things like that. That was not allowed. That was banned during the plague period in Florence. It had to be burned. Now, prostitutes were also ordered out of the city. Now, whether that is because Florence was highly religious and they thought that it looked bad, like God was doing this, hi Mary Beth, as punishment, or if it's because, you know, I mean, if they're intermingling with a lot of people, they're going to be more apt to spread the plague. Now, anyone from Pisa or Genoa were banned from entering Florence. So they were kind of putting a correlation between the fact, even though they didn't understand like germs and things like that, they were pretty much kind of correlating that people coming from these areas seemed to be carrying sickness with them. So those people were banned. Now, by April 11th, an emergency 8-person committee was established. In essence, this would be the first board of health to make sure that these orders were followed, enforced, and that burials were carried out properly. So they understood the fact that dead bodies could spread disease. By mid-June, the death toll had increased to 100 people per day, and by July and August, that number had skyrocketed to an estimated 400 deaths per day from the plague. And by 1353, the population of Florence had dropped to half of what it once was, which was a depletion of 60,000 people. Because of the sheer numbers of dead, Florence eventually had to resort to mass graves. Now, one of the problems that Florence was having was that as people fled Florence to escape the plague, some already infected, of course, they would only compound the problem. But as the plague spread to the Florentine countryside, the farmers. Okay, hold on, let me back up. So they had to actually go to like actually doing mass graves and things like that. And I believe it was actually Florence. Yeah, I'm getting confused. Florence, to where actually the Pope had given them some extra land to be able to do that. But as the people fled Florence to escape the plague, some already infected only compounded the problem. As the plague spread into the Florentine countryside, the farmers, which provided Florence with meat and produce, started to die. There were not enough workers left to supply food. Livestock either ran off or died as the crops rotted in the fields. And at that point, chaos ensued. So let's see what's going on in the comments real quick, and we're going to finish up with Florence real quick. Yes, I'm doing well, Mary Beth. I'm doing well. And then Cindy says, I just told my son the prostitutes have to leave. Yeah, and the prostitutes are going to come up again when we get to another city. And it may surprise you. It may not, but it may surprise you. Let's see. So Maud says, but why? The prostitutes only spread love. All right, so we had spoken in the first episode about the feudal system, and this is where it's going to you're going to start seeing kind of a change, because like I said, this plague changed modern world. It didn't just change and devastate things then. It actually brought about certain changes that affected what we know now as the modern world. So interestingly, by the 1350s, skilled workers' wages increased. Now, this was during this die-off period by about 200%. Non-skilled workers were making about 3 times what they had pre-plague. And the ones at the very top were the ones that were worse off. So you had your lords, you had your knights, you had your nobles and things like that. You had your monks, and then you had your peasants when you're kind of looking at a feudal system. So the ones at the bottom, everything kind of flipped because there were more of that particular class, and it killed off about half of Florence. It's going to devastate the higher classes more. So everything kind of flipped on its head. So the large number of nobles that did wind up staying, especially those that remained in the city central itself during the outbreak, were really bad off. And this crisis of disease quickly became a crisis of politics and social order. And because of this crisis in politics and the flip in social order, we would see this happen over and over again in the medieval post-plague years. So this kind of gets something going. This is where you're going to see the end to the feudal system and the manorial system in Western Europe. Also in 1347, the plague, and this is where we're going to move. We're moving from Italy, and we're going to move to France now. So also in 1347, the plague reached Avignon, France, which at the time was, and I didn't know this, I learned this, the seat of the papacy. They had moved from Rome to Avignon in 1309. So at that time, the Pope was actually living in Avignon, France. This was also the time that was known as the Babylonian captivity, as the Catholic Church was much different than the church we know today. It was known as a miserable and hedonistic time. Avignon was overcrowded, dirty, it stank. Working conditions were difficult due to what they called the menstrual winds, which would blow out of the south of France, and with those would carry kind of just a really noxious smell, as well as a very fine dust. Most church officials worked inside in the dark with the shutters closed to keep out the wind in the middle of the day by candlelight. So it was a pretty miserable place in general to be living at that time. And it was not uncommon, in an effort to relieve the stresses of daily work, that just about every church official would spend the evening filled with drinking and visiting the brothels. Avignon at that time had 11 whorehouses, whereas Rome only had 2. And these were the conditions when the plague made its way into Avignon. When it showed up, it came primarily in the form of the pneumonic plague. Later, the bubonic plague form would start to show up, suggesting that the people carrying the pneumonic form showed up first, then later the rats carrying the infected fleas showed up after. Because Avignon was the seat of the papacy at that time, there was a high concentration of people that could both read and write in multiple languages, which means that historians have a thorough record and documentation of what occurred in Avignon during the plague years when it occurred. Probably also means that we probably lost a lot of scholars as well during the die-off in this particular area. So there would have been a big brain suck for the medieval world. The city also banned the use of handling spices unless they had been stored for a year, as it had become known that merchants from the east were carrying the plague. Scapegoats also began to pop up. People being blamed for poisoning wells, and we'll get into it in the next episode. Unfortunately, for Jews, they're always the scapegoat, and they did not slide by during this particular outbreak, escaping that, unfortunately, sadly. But if you were blamed for somehow poisoning wells or causing an outbreak, of course, the church's reaction is to burn you at the stake. By this point in Avignon, the priests were refusing to give last rites. Families began to abandon their sick family members, and parents refusing to nurse or care for their sick children. People dropped dead in the streets with no proper burial services being performed. In Avignon, in the Avignon case, the Rhine River actually wound up being consecrated in order to dispose of the dead, as they actually got to a point to where there was no more left to bury them. And for the ones that were buried, Avignon faced with them problems of wild pigs and dogs digging up the dead or parts of the dead and dragging them around the city, because they would have to, if you ever read, even if it's like historical fiction about like London and places like that, it was not unheard of for churches, because that's where most of your cemeteries were, unless it was like a mass grave or something like that. But even in churches, like a family would buy one plot and they would just stack people on top of each other until they had no more room. And during like the cholera outbreak, during, I believe it was the late 1800s, late 1800s, I believe, around the time of Jack the Ripper, some of the churchyards, the cemeteries, had to be shut down because they would ooze putrid, because there were so many dead bodies that were buried in one little plot of land, or walls would break due to the sheer weight of dead bodies buried in a cemetery, a church cemetery, and would fall out into the streets and things. So, and they experienced that a lot in like France and things like that. So, they had to use the Rhine River as a way to bury their dead, and the ones that were buried wound up being dug up by wild hogs and dogs and dragged around the city, which probably only compounded the outbreak of the plague. Now, between 50 and 55% of the Avignon population died. However, if it had not been for the death of one citizen of Avignon, a lady by the name of Laura de Noves, she was the wife of Hugh de Sade. And yes, you did hear that last name correctly. He was like a family member of the Marquis de Sade. So the Marquis de Sade was actually one of his ancestors. But if it had not been for Laura de Noves, we may not have ever had certain parts, or we may not have ever had the Renaissance. Laura's death inspired and having a lasting effect on a poet by the name of Francisco Petraccia. She would become his muse for more than 300 sonnets. Now, Patricia, I guess as they would refer to him, he was Italian. He was an Italian scholar, poet, and humanist, whose poems addressed to Laura, an idealized beloved, contributed to the Renaissance flowering lyrics of poetry. But in the end, Avignon would return to business as usual until the papacy would eventually return to Rome some years later. So let's see what's going on in the chats real quick, and then we're going to move to England. Those Italians. Yes, the spaghetti. Yes, we have to love the Italians. Let's see. And then Tom says, hey there, who here, honey? The prostitute people. Well, I got better. Oh. She turned me into a newt. You know, that is a movie. We were talking about that just the other day when I was researching for that. I was telling my youngest, we need to watch that movie because I've got it on DVD. It is a great movie. Oh, Poltergeist is a good one too. You moved the headstone, but you left the bodies. What do you use to burn witches? Wood. And what does wood do when you put it in water? It floats. And what else floats in water? A duck. Therefore, if she weighs the same as a duck, she is a witch. Spreading the word. There you go. So Maud says the church people were spreading the word of God to the hardworking brawls. All right. So England. All right. So if you look at a map, so you have Kaffa over here. You would have to go around and down around Italy and come up to Genoa. Through there's a lot of islands that the ships would have probably stopped at, such as Sicily and places like that. And they actually had outbreaks of plague, generally in the same time, but actually maybe a day or two earlier, as it went up into Genoa. So it infected the entire Italian peninsula. It's also moving in from like the Crimea area, moving in this way westward. So now we're going to be moving, let's see, that way. We're going to be moving that way up towards like Ireland and England and things like that, Scotland, things like that. Now, Barcelona, sorry, everything's backwards. Barcelona and everything, now they're about down here, if that makes sense. And they're starting to break out with the plague as well. A lot of stuff is happening in 1348 is when a lot of stuff will start to really hit. So let me wet my whistle. So by the end of 1348, the Black Death had enveloped all of Italy, most of France, and was beginning to work its way into England. As we talked about in our first episode, many scholars and scientists now believe that there may have been other diseases that came with the 1340s plague. In the case of the emergence of the plague in England, there were also references, like I had mentioned in the first episode, to a possible murine of livestock. As earlier records tell of plague infecting not only people but animals too. The case in England seemed to be to the extreme. So even in places like such as Italy and places like that, some of the what they call the chroniclists, which would have been kind of your recorders, people that recorded history at that time, did notate that there were animals that were affected by the plague as well. It seemed to be at a real extreme in England. So this is given the possibility of some kind of murine or anthrax that had not been identified that went zoonotic, as well as possibly some type of hemorrhagic fever. The English chronicles also noted in 1348 issues with the weather, noting heavy rains from summer to Christmas. And these were in several different areas within England, the same time span. And all of them saying that it ended around Christmas. That was actually followed directly by the plague. England already was overpopulated and would have been malnourished due to the failure of crops during this rainy period prior to the plague making its appearance. Now, this is kind of funny yet kind of sad. I mean, if the plague could have some sort of symbiotic knowledge or like a higher knowledge, like it could not have hit in the worst, most terrible times, because not only were most of England malnourished and probably on the verge of starvation due to 6 months of rainy season, what grains or crops that may have survived could, or most likely, that these crops would have been infected with a mold or fungus, which could have given symptoms comparable to when one ingests LSD. And now France had something that happened right around this time. I want to say it was just a little after this time or a little before this time. They called the Great Horror. And that's exactly what happened. There was a type of fungus that a lot of people ingested, and they basically were tripping their balls off. So just think about a population, a whole population, dealing with the plague, tripping their balls, and just overall being paranoid. Of course, the land crunch had hit the subservient population hard. Most people could not survive on farming alone. So the medieval England was moving to a more cash-based economy at that time, which probably didn't help a lot. Probably one of the reasons that they did was because a lot of people were out of work. But due to population, there were probably a lot of people that didn't have a lot of money at that time either. Now, the mortality rate in this area could go as high as 80% in some areas. So England was hit hard. In June of 1348, the plague first enters England through the port city of Weymouth. From there, it travels, around Cornwall and shows up in Bristol. Then to Gloucester. Because many of England's trade routes were rivers, the plague was able to move quickly into the interior of the country. Fishing vessels also spread it to the rest of the port cities, towns, and coastal waterways. Oddly, though, the plague didn't show up in London in force until the beginning of 1349. Sadly, though, when it got there, it made up for lost time. Due to the delay in the plague reaching London, London was hit especially hard by what some scholars refer to as the three-pronged attack. Plague moved from Gloucester over land, moving slowly, making its way southeastward through the trade routes to London. At the same time, the plague moved out of Weymouth, heading northeast, hitting Salisbury and then Winchester, moving along trade routes to London. Around the same period of time, the third point of entry would come directly in through their harbor, so that by 1349, the three-prong converged on London with a fury. The population of London at that time was around 65,000, but by 1350, only about half remained, with the other half either dead or due to flight from London to escape the plague. In the end, the losses among the nobles was about 25 to 30%. The peasants 40 to 70%, and in some cases as high as 80%. So we're seeing a difference here than we saw in Florence. The priestly losses were around 45%. And this presented a problem as what is called a heriot or a death tax, okay? So the nobles are going to wind up getting hit really hard, but in a different way, because they had such a die-off of peasants. There were a lot of households, and remember, they're still under a feudal system. There would be a lot of households that would have lost, if not their entire family, at least some of the working adults. Now, during that time, they had what was called a heriot or a death tax. Whenever a peasant died on a manor, their family would owe that lord a heriot, which is a tribute paid out to the lord in some form because they lost a body. They lost a working body. And normally that tribute would be in the form of a live animal, usually their best beast. But because of the high mortality rate among the peasant class, manors had more animals than they knew what to do with. This also caused a drop in prices on livestock, which made the lords need to dump the livestock onto the market because they were too expensive to feed. Now, once that happened, that further depressed the prices of the meat. And also remember that may have actually helped to spur some of the livestock murine that may have been going around as well. Now, to get a good look at exactly, how this kind of changed the feudal and the manorial system, we're going to look at a place by the name of Walsham, England. But let me take a look at the chats real quick. Hi, Kisa, how are you? And so Tom says, some things in life are bad. They can really make you mad. Other things just make you swear and curse when you're chewing on life's gristle. Don't grumble, give a whistle, and this'll help things run out for the best. And all right, let's see. So Maud says, death tax, absolutely evil. Well, the manorial system was a little bit different, but yeah, when you thought of like a serf, that might be, I mean, these were serfs, don't get me wrong, but the manorial system was a wee bit different because they were actually like familiar ties, and kind of what you associate with manners. But yeah, they're absolutely evil, and we still have them. We still have death taxes. Just look up death taxes in the United States tax code. And Melissa says, I mean, if I knew what I was getting into, I would have totally gone for the LSD mold, right? I mean, hopefully it would be like pleasant at least, or it make you think that it was pleasant, for goodness sake. The dragons are guarding my pantry. Well, good. I'm glad you're doing well. I'm glad you're doing well, Kisa. All right. So we're going to take a look at Walsham, England. At the beginning of the summer of 1349, Walsham found itself suddenly deprived of about half of its population. Some 700 people died. Over half of them were under 16 years of age, and those over 50 almost wiped out entirely. Fortunately, the death toll among those between the two groups, who formed the mass of the working population, was probably about 30%. And there remained about 500 adults available to start the work of recovery. Now, that may sound like a lot, but it's really not. However, this recovery would give us the first glimpse of what we more associate with modern economics, as it would turn the feudal and manorial system, in this case, we're talking about the manorial system, on its head. Manorialism represents the economy proportion of feudalism, where all aspects of life were centered on a lord's manor, including the village, the church, the farm, the land, the mill, and governances, you name it. So basically, it's like you see in some of like those old Gothic like love and romance stories, to where the lord of the area, that's his manor, that's actually his farm, but it is so large that it can encompass villages and things like that, churches, mills, all kinds of different things. So they pretty much, everything happened there. Now, manorialism involved a hierarchy of reciprocal obligations that exchanged labor or rents for access to land. Manorialism also encompassed the political and often deep personal and family relations and ties between the lord of the manor and his peasants. So when you hear somebody say, I have been the butler of this house for 3 generations, this would have been probably from what would have once been a manorial system. This allowed the lord of the manor governmental power, which included the maintenance of a court. Now, in the case of Walsham, it was a bit different. The lord of Walsham actually gave his peasants a certain amount of land. But now, in order for you to keep that land, you owe the Lord so many days of service in his fields. Okay. So that's how this particular area worked. So it was a reciprocal obligation. And they were usually, they were close. They were like extended family in a lot of ways, in most cases, or at least in the case of this particular area. Now, this particular court was called the manorial court, where it was the lowest courts of the law in England during the feudal period. They had civil jurisdiction, limited both in subject matter and geography. They dealt with matters over which the lord of the manor had jurisdiction, primarily torts, local contracts, and land tenatures. And their powers only extended to those who lived within the lands of their manor, because their trade-off is they would protect these villages from raiders and outsiders and things like that, in order for the peasants to owe a tribute to the lord of so many days of work. In the case of Walsham, things were a bit different. The way that the way they record it, okay, in this particular court during the plague years, was that you see a lot of record of where they would convene for the court, and as they started to convene for the court, which would usually convene once or twice a month, there were less and less people there. That would include the nobles as well as the peasants. As when this would happen, so say I had a cousin that lived in another village that may have been in that manor, but lived in another village, and that cousin died, then they could will me their land. But in order for me to keep that land, I would now owe service of so many days to the Lord for my land, as well as so many days of service to the Lord for the other land. So it got to a point to where there were so few workers left and so many people being willed sections of land that people started to refuse. Not necessarily because they didn't want the land, but because there was no physical way to work their land and owe the Lord so many days of work for each parcel of land. In some cases, there were only orphans left. So you may have a 3-year-old that would inherit all this land, even if he had wanted to. There's no way he could have kept this. So there were some big problems that were going on for these lords. It even got to the point to where this was happening with lords. So in the case of Wilsham, the lord actually died, which means that kind of everything would wind up going to his wife, which at this time was a lady by the name of Lady Rosa. He dies of the plague. She gets sick, but she recovers. The reason she takes over is because his second or third cousin has been notified that he is now the sole owner of this particular manor. However, whether his cousin dies or his cousin's like, look, I got my own manor to take care of, I can't take care of another manor, he never shows up. Now, of course, the court says, well, we need to compel him to take this other manor. Of course, that goes nowhere because everybody is dying. Now, this goes kind of a year or so, but I'm sure it seems like a really long time because people are dying left and right. But eventually, Lady Rosa does wind up, dying of something, whether it was some other disease or complications to the plague or what have you, even though she may have gotten over the initial infection. When that happened in Wilsham, that cut all ties that they had with the manor. So if someone came in and took over the manor or purchased the manor, like a noble, they have no ties to this person. They have no familiarity with this person and no reason to really want to do anything. And they've also realized that they can go down the road to another manor and make more money. So let's see what's going on in the comments real quick. And I think I may have frozen. I may have froze. I sure enough did. So I'm froze. I'm going to pop out and pop back in real quick. Okay, I'm back. Sorry. I don't know what's going on. I don't know if anybody's noticed, like, the internet is acting really odd. So anyway, sorry about that. So when Lady Rosa died, everybody kind of just said, "Phooey on it. Look, we can go down to this other farm down here and we can make twice as much as we were making here. And we have no loyalties to the new Lord, blah, 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 blah." And you're going to wind up seeing this all over England. This happens all over England. All right. Now, it got so bad that in 1351, in response to all this, the king and the parliament, and this would have been King Edward III, as well as the English parliament, their response was a law they created by the name of the Statute of Laborers. And it was in response to this ability for these no longer really serfs, because, I mean, there's not really anybody that can enforce anything. They're finding out they can go down to other farms and stuff and make more money. So it was due to the labor shortage, which aimed at regulating the labor force by prohibiting the requesting or offering of wages higher than pre-plague standards and limiting movement in search of better conditions. Now, the status of the laborers, or the statute of the laborers, was, of course, a very unpopular law with the peasants who wanted higher wages and better living standards. and was a contributing factor to subsequent peasant revolts. And I looked into this. It really wasn't enforced that much overall. But yeah, it wound up, it didn't turn out the way they wanted. So at the end of 1349 and into 1350, the Black Plague, or Black Death, rather than moving into Scotland, this would not occur until later in 1350, would make its way, like something straight out of a classic horror film, into Scandinavia and Norway in the most unusual way. So let me see what's going on in the chats real quick. Gremlins, yes, we have gremlins in the system. We demand more money. Yeah, and so it kind of you kind of see where the whole like free, I don't want to say at this point free market competition, but the competition on wages. That's the reason a free market is so important, because if you have competition, you have higher wages. So let's see. Yes, it was the Black Death in the internet. Exactly, Maud. So Kisa asks, was there a connection with the sweating sickness and the Black Death? I want to say Kisa just because I didn't see it come up in any of my research or any of the books I've ever read, that it was part of the Black Death. But now understand that this particular plague, the White Pesties, it's been circling Europe and the world, popping in and popping out and popping in of kind of existence for forever. But there are really only 3 really big outbreaks. There was the Justinian outbreak in like the 500s. There was the one in the 1800s. I want to say 1834, or it might have been a little after that, that broke out in China, in Hong Kong to be specific. And then this one, this was the granddaddy of them all, because of just the sheer damage. They all do damage, but just how fast it moved, and it just took over, just a whole section of the planet. But I don't remember the sweating sickness coming up. Let's see. Was it trolls that brought the plague? We're going to get to that in a minute. It's funny you say that. And then Liz says, I mean, this is the apocalypse. Why wouldn't some kind of bug go after the book of the face as well? And then Ma says, was it the trolls that brought the plague to Scandinavia? Ah, maybe not trolls. Let's go for 500. In 1349, a ship, let's see, I'm sorry, at the end of 1349 and into 1350, the Black Death, like I said, would make its way into Scandinavia and Norway in the most unusual way. A ship carrying wool set out for England, bound for some destination to the north. During its journey, crew members started dying. Attempting to quarantine the sick on board failed. The plague took one person after another until every last crew member died. The disease itself lived on in the other creatures aboard. With some good luck, the ghost ship might have drifted into sea and sank. But the 14th century wasn't the century for good luck. The ship ran aground near Bergen, the Bergen harbor in Norway, where its living inhabitants, rats and fleas, made it into the country. So it actually entered Norway via a ghost ship. Now, this might be an appropriate and fitting entry to the Black Death into Scandinavia. Scandinavians' responses are unique, as it took on a more folkloric response to the plague. These folkloric responses seem to be unique and are only found here and nowhere else. They're only found in Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and Finland. The representations morphed into various variations of an old woman, a set of children, or an old man, or in some cases, horrible animals or monsters from hell. Now, if you look at a lot of the Norwegian folklore, you will see a lot of references to an old lady with a broom or a rake. Petra, I think is how you pronounce her name. There are a lot of, and I tried to find some poems, but you pretty much have to purchase a book in order to do it. But basically, the way it goes, and you'll see the same with the broom, with the children, and with the old man. He normally carries a shovel. But the way it kind of goes is if the woman, hey Pogo, if Petra, the old woman, shows up and she's carrying a broom, that means everybody in the house will die. If she's carrying a rake, that means only some. Same with the old man. If he shows up with a shovel, some will survive. And same with the children. Let's see, or in some cases, horrible animals from hell. As the countries within Scandinavia were hit at different times, Iceland had a different experience with the plague, as it would escape the first wave completely and actually did not experience plague until 1402. There is some doubt that what struck Scandinavia may not have been Y. pestis, but some other altogether different that there seems to be. Okay. They wonder if it may have been something else other than the Y. pestis bacteria, because when they look back at a lot of the plague pits and different things like that, and if you really watch some of these people like that do anthropology and things like that, they'll find like the old trash dumps of places to where they can go through it and figure out what were people eating at that time, what was going on at that time, that kind of thing. And they did not find a lot of evidence of the black rat in Northern Europe during the outbreak of the plague. But to combat that, scientists proposed that instead that it might have been somehow connected to Rattus norvenginus, or the brown rat / the Norwegian rat, which don't tend to host the oriental fleas that carries Y. pestis, though it is now known that the oriental or black rat flea can, however, live up to 30 to 50 days without a host. So it could have also come in trade goods such as blankets and wool and things like that. So it may have been due to the fleas. They really don't know. That's kind of just what they're surmising, because like I said, in some areas there just wasn't a lot of recorded information. The plague could have come into Scandinavia through trade goods such as wool or grain, or like Avignon, the pneumonic form could have come through and first entered into Scandinavia. Because that did tend to be what they have found, that tend to be kind of the primary form that spread in the Scandinavian area, because it could easily spread from person to person. Now, the Scandinavian labor and economic system was a bit different than most of Western Europe, as the feudal and manorial system was not widely used and the land was free owned. There were places like England relied on the family unit. That was not the case with Scandinavia. Scandinavia relied on the young male population as its workforce. Marriage and children, of course, were important. But marrying too young was not the norm, and it was kind of frowned on, because in essence, it would take the male, that young male or male in the prime of his life, out of the labor pool. So they waited later to marry, pre-plague. Now, the spread of the plague through Northern Europe was caused primarily through overland trade routes. And much of Scandinavia consisted of mountain villages that were heavily relied on trade rather than subsistence farming due to the geological layout of the land. So think of Haiti, or like the Austrian villas that were way up, like in the Sound of Music, way up in the hills and the mountains. They really didn't have a lot of good farming land, so they relied a lot on trade. Now, this reliance of a young male labor force, and because they were having to travel the trade routes, it hit the male labor force really hard. Because of this, the demographic changed, and people started marrying younger, which further diminished the labor pool. So everybody it pretty much sucked for everybody. Once Sweden succumbed to the plague in 1350, the Black Death's conquest was pretty much complete, as the plague moving overland from the south and the Italian peninsula, hitting Budapest, Vienna, Munich, and other cities in that area in 1349. And in the new year of 1350, hit the cities of Nuremberg, Prague, Cologne, and Hamburg. As the northern wave brought to Norway in 1349 moved south and east, and it crashed into another wave of pestilence, also moving north and west over land. So everything just kind of converged right there around Sweden. From Italy to Ireland, from France to Denmark, the Black Death's conquest of Europe was complete once Sweden had completely succumbed to the plague. From 1351 to 1353, the plague would complete its journey by heading east and south through Poland and Russia, ending up almost exactly where it had started. So that, my friends, is what happened with the Black Death. Now, what we're going to talk about in our last episode next week are kind of the consequences of the Black Death, the aftermath. After it went through, what happened. We're kind of delve into that a little bit. Hi, Dawn. How are you? So let's take a look at the comments real quick. We're going to end this with the comments rather than just a formal goodbye. Let's see. Large Marge. Okay. Yeah, Austria. The hills are alive with the sound of music and plague. Liz says, I feel like that's insulting to the plague. Yeah, right? The plague does spread very easy. And then Maud says, it wasn't the black rat, it was spread via black metal. Yes, they smallpox blanketed themselves. Exactly. All right. So does anybody have any questions, anything like that, anything they want to share? Because we've gone over a little bit, and so we're going to go ahead and wrap this up here shortly. I will keep the chat open for just the next couple of minutes. So Don says, the Black Death was horrible. One of the worst plagues in history. Spanish flu was bad too. Absolutely, Don, you're absolutely right. We absolutely did. All right, so we're going to go ahead and we're going to wrap that up. I think that StreamYard is telling us we must go bye-bye. So I do appreciate you joining us. Like I said, join me back here next Wednesday for the completion of the Great Pestilence. And stay tuned for our other content artists throughout this coming week. Pleasant nightmares, everybody. Bye-bye.